Hey everyone, I'm Joseph Merz. I run an international interdisciplinary research institute, a small one, that works on existential threats. And we primarily focus on a thing called anthropogenic ecological overshoot, and we do this at the behavioural level. I'm also a senior fellow of the Global Evergreening Alliance, and I'm an advisor to a number of NGOs. I was the lead author on a paper with Mike and a number of our colleagues, including the father of the ecological footprint, Bill Rees, and evolutionary behavioural ecologist Phoebe Barnard. And the paper was called World Scientists Warning, the Behavioural Crisis Driving Ecological Overshoot. And it was really successful. We were very fortunate. It was picked up by The Guardian. It was covered by Vogue multiple times and The Economist and a number of others. And it still has an attention score in the top 1% of all tracked academic research. And it's been downloaded over 70,000 times. And its success has led to ongoing relationships with the Government of Ireland and the United Nations. Also a bunch of other influential and international organisations and industry leaders. And in the case of the Government of Ireland, they commissioned us to run a workshop or a series of workshops on the behavioural crisis across that included a number of their government departments, and that went all the way up to their Prime Minister's office. And so considering my objective with the paper was essentially to influentially name a human behavioural crisis as a more accurate and sort of useful way of framing our current global predicament, I think the results have been fantastic. And I'd hoped that it would really become a strong cornerstone to build this concept out from. And I think that's happened. So it's this behavioural crisis concept that I'm here to talk to you about today. I'm assuming you've all read the paper, at least a few of you. But don't worry if you haven't, because essentially the paper posits there's a crisis of human behaviour that's driving ecological overshoot and its many symptoms like climate change. And it really just demonstrates how our current capitalist, neoliberal, what I often refer to as modern techno-industrial civilization, has evolved to exploit our previously adaptive evolutionary impulses for essentially resources, what we see as profit. So today, though, I'm going to go a bit beyond the paper, quite a lot beyond the paper, and talk to you about roughly where we're at with this work. And I'm not really going to talk much about overshoot itself, as with Mike as your lecturer, I'm sure you know plenty about it. But all I will say is that virtually all of the major threats that we're seeing arising from the natural world are symptoms. And they're symptoms of ecological overshoot. And these include things like ocean acidification, the rise in novel entities, biodiversity loss, climate change, ecosystem collapse. And it's important that we're explicit also that overshoot has three what I call levers, and these are population, consumption, and waste. And like the symptoms that I just mentioned, none of these levers can be addressed in isolation. But also it's worth mentioning that ultimately it's our access to energy that has enabled our species to overshoot planetary boundaries. And we can sort of use these, this knowledge and these levers as a sort of a litmus test to tell us how valuable these touted quote unquote solutions really are. You can ask yourself pretty simple questions like, do the proposed solutions limit our species' access to energy, or do they directly work to shape population, consumption, and waste, and all three of them? Because if they don't, then they're really not going to change much. It's also worth noting that when I talk about behavior change and behavior in general, I'm not just talking about this at the individual level. I'm really talking about all the systemic, social, and evolutionary drivers of our behaviors, individually and collectively. And that's a really critical point to make. And the reason we talk so much about behavior is because there's this primacy to behavior. Humanity's physical behavior is the point at which it physically interacts with the ecosphere. So it's the most proximal driver of overshoot is really another way of putting it, and lots of other things. So for this reason, its inclusion in any discussions about planetary boundaries or sustainability or anything like that is absolutely critical. And as you'll know, we've passed a number of planetary boundaries, and so our collective behaviors matter now like they never have before. In fact, I think you can say that for the best outcomes, we will really have to behaviorally design our way out of this mess. And once we understand that, it makes sense to anchor ourselves at this behavioral level, and from there work upstream to explore the drivers and the influences of our behaviors. These including evolutionary, systemic, institutional, and beyond. And we really don't stand a chance, though, of shaping our collective behaviors if we don't accurately understand how and why they occur. And another important point to make here is that human behavior and what influences it is remarkably complex, incredibly complex. So there's nuance to everything you're about to hear. There's a lot of complexity behind it, but there are also some fundamentals, and these fundamentals often get forgotten too. So the first concept that I'm going to talk about today is called selection by consequences. And you'll all be familiar with natural selection, the selection of genetic traits across generations. Well, B.F. Skinner and a few others laid the foundations for other levels of selection, essentially what we'll call individual selection and cultural selection. And you can think of individual selection as the selection of behaviors within the lifetime of an individual. And cultural selection, I like to think of it as sort of an aggregate of individual selection. But for now, though, the thing that we really want to remember here is that behavior is selected by its consequences. And at this individual level, we have labels for the consequences. We refer to them as reinforcement or punishment. And reinforcement essentially means something occurring that makes the behavior more likely to occur. And punishing means something occurring that makes the behavior less likely to occur, essentially. And for each of these categories, there are subcategories of positive and negative, and there's also a thing called extinction, but we won't have time to go into that. But basically, you can have positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. So let's play with a quick example just to solidify some of this. So we've got this guy. We'll say his name's Gary. He starts a logging company that he can run remotely. And all the logging that he does, say Gary lives in Auckland in New Zealand in a nice house, but all the logging that he does is done in the rainforests in Borneo. So the short-term consequences of Gary's behaviors are reinforcing for him and for his family. He makes loads of money. He buys a Bentley. His family thinks he's pretty cool. We could say that his behavior is reinforced in a number of ways. But then Greenpeace comes along and they forecast that in 10 years' time, if the logging continues, Borneo will pass this biodiversity tipping point. And now there are protests at the logging site. And these are what we would call punishing consequences, right? We just talked about those. But Gary doesn't care. And so why doesn't Gary care? And Gary doesn't care because, like other humans, Gary is an innate temporal, spatial, and social discounter. So that means that if the consequences are far away in time or in space or socially, then their importance is discounted. So remember, those reinforcing consequences, they were here and now. The money was flowing, his needs were being met. However, these punishing consequences, they're in another country, and the people affected aren't his people. And besides, the 10 years that Greenpeace is talking about is a long time away. So this is a really clear example of spatial, social, and temporal discounting. And there are a lot of complexities to all this, particularly when it comes to the neurochemistry side, the role that the dopaminergic system plays, for example. In gambling, we get what's called intermittent reinforcement, and that's a really powerful form of reinforcement. So in terms of the dopaminergic system, it relates to what we call reward prediction error. And the simplified version is we get a hit of dopamine when the actual consequences are better than the ones we predict. So hence the word error in reward prediction error. And this really exists to help us learn which behaviors are worth repeating. But all of this is really a great representation of what's occurring around the world. If we just add in evolutionary impulses, cheap access to energy, and the cultural selection component, you've pretty much got our modern techno-industrial civilization. And another important concept to add in here is that of adaptive versus maladaptive. So at the individual level, adaptive can be defined as behaviors or design features or even strategies that promote an individual's propagation of its genes into future generations. And by this definition, we can say that Gary's logging behavior is not only reinforcing, but it's also adaptive. But what's adaptive for the gene isn't always adaptive at scale. So when you consider the social aspects and the aggregate of these behaviors shaping our culture or our civilization, the consequences can quite easily reach a scale where they are collectively highly maladaptive to the point of being existential threats in themselves. And again, our modern techno-industrial civilization is a prime example of this. We could say that it exists in the space between the immediate, reinforcing and adaptive consequences of our individual and collective behaviors and their delayed and discounted punishing and existentially maladaptive co-consequences. Because remember, behavior is selected by consequences, so it won't be selected out until those punishing consequences are felt. Another way of putting this is if we are essentially smart or dumb enough to continually adapt to push those compounding consequences down the line, we can reach a point where those consequences aren't felt until they are existential. And that's the point that we're at the moment. So we'll come back to adaptive and maladaptive later, but in the meantime, another really critical piece to understand about behavior is that our behavior is essentially about meeting what we perceive as our needs. So broadly, we can break needs into a couple of different categories: physiological needs and psychological needs. Physiological needs that humans have, things like air, water, food, warmth, those sorts of things. And psychological needs are things like love and belonging and self-esteem. And our motivation for these needs or meeting these needs fluctuates. So it fluctuates based on sort of biological and environmental factors. You could broadly group them into. So when your body tells you you're cold, for example, your motivation for behaviors that bring you warmth increases. But technically, it's not actually your motivation for the behaviors. It's your motivation that your motivation increases the value of the consequences. So that impacts the likelihood that you'll engage in that behavior. But anytime we talk about needs, we really should talk about the influence of evolutionary impulses. And some people find it helpful to think of evolutionary impulses as predispositions. Some of the more dominant evolutionary impulses that we can see around us today are to acquire and amass resources, to defend our territories, to display dominance, to signal status, to seek pleasure, and to avoid pain. And most of those, all of those apart from the last one, are predominantly associated with males. They're dominant in our current paradigm because for a number of reasons that we won't have time to go into. But the point really is that you'll be hard pressed to find a single human need that can't be traced back to an evolutionary impulse. So some examples of how evolutionary impulses manifest in our world today: signaling status with houses or boats or planes or clothes or cars, amassing financial wealth, starting wars over perceived territories, or deporting everyone from your territory that's not like you. In the Institute, we call this the contextualization of evolutionary impulses. And we'd say that this contextualization occurs in what we refer to as the information landscape. And you can think of the information landscape as a combination of our physical and social environments. So humans form these mental models of the world essentially through observation and experience. And this is mediated by our senses and a raft of conscious and unconscious psychological, kind of cognitive, biological, and environmental factors. But ultimately, it's these observations and these experiences that lead us to form expectations. So when it comes to our impulses to signal status, for example, how do we know what status should look like? How do we know what desirable resources are? And we know this, we know because of our observations and our experience and the expectations that they form. So if these expectations are confirmed by our observations and our continued experiences, then we have no need to update those mental models. So if Gary's expectation is that a wealthy individual signals status with a private jet, and his physical and social environments continue to confirm this expectation, then guess how he's going to try and satisfy his evolutionary impulse to signal status. Now, again, there's a huge amount of nuance to all this. For example, I'm different to Gary. My biology is different, my psychology, my social environment, my physical environment, my development has been, my experiences are, my identity is different. And personally, I signal status in my own kind of countercultural way. But the takeaway is that we all have these impulses, and it's just due to complexities that our impulses aren't all manifesting the same way. So everything we've talked about this far can essentially be viewed as a more accurate representation of how the world works, more accurate than the one that most humans hold anyway. And I won't go into the evolutionary reasons why this might be, because we don't really have time. So It's really the point that I want to make more than anything is that it's pretty safe to say that our species is largely blind to these unguided evolutionary processes and the systems and the complexity that shape our behaviors and our norms and our cultures. But what if we didn't leave these processes unguided? What if we began to intentionally shape human evolution at the behavioral level? And what might that look like? And the remarkable thing here is that we, us humans, don't actually know what this looks like in terms of actual behaviors. What I mean is when we don't actually know what we're aiming for on the ground behaviorally. You might think that this work had been done, but we are yet to come across it if it has. All of the efforts globally to deal with the symptoms of overshoot, like climate change, and really the best we've come up with behaviorally is recycle, fly less, eat less red meat. Is that going to cut it? And is that really all we're aiming for when we could be thinking about radically different ways to meet our needs? And so I'm constantly blown away by this myopic view of needs that's shaped by our current norms, when across human cultures, across space and time, there's so much richness and diversity, and there's so much fluidity to it. So our core needs have really stayed pretty consistent, but the way that we've met those needs across cultures and across time is wonderfully different. It's wonderfully diverse and wonderfully fluid. So if we understood our needs more deeply, maybe we could radically recontextualize the way we look to meet them. And not only in these in reinforcing ways that we talked about, but also in truly adaptive, ecologically beneficial and restorative ways. Ways that enable people to step off this current paradigm and into another, deeper, far more adaptive and resilient one. One where all we all have a much more accurate model of reality and are actively guiding the emergent collective system and culture. And this is where we get to the exciting potential of this work. We could bring about these shifts by working to shape the information landscape. And this is, again, at the heart of the work that we do in the Institute. Our information landscape is littered with consequences, behaviors, and norms that, as we know, are reinforcing and adaptive in the short term, but hugely maladaptive in the long term. But we could begin to shape this information landscape consciously, and we could do that as simply as changing the stories that we're telling, explicit stories and implicit ones. Stories are a critical part of how humans make sense of information. And when we think about the dominant stories we're telling right now, what do you think they are? They're mostly modeling and perpetuating behaviors, norms, and consequences that are incredibly maladaptive. So what if we used what we've learned? What if we began to create immediate social consequences for people who had significant influence over the information landscape, for example? To start changing our stories to model behaviors, norms, and consequences again that are reinforcing and truly adaptive. I mean, imagine if Hollywood, for example, depicted movies of a successful individual as someone who was heavily involved in their community, someone who spent their time on ecologically restorative behaviors that were linked to directly meeting the needs of their family and their wider community. Someone whose territory wasn't a fenced townhouse, but rather their local community. The key here is that what is modeled, it really has to be reinforcing and adaptive. If it's not, and when I say adaptive, I mean adaptive in the truest sense of the word, and if it's not, it won't persist. So what's also clear from anthropological findings is that individual communities have to be able to interact with this information themselves. In other words, it can't just be this top-down implementation it will always fail and has always failed. But by intentionally shaping the information landscape, we can create this kind of, as I mentioned, alternative paradigm for people to step onto as the old one falls away. And you might be thinking, well, I like films that show ridiculous levels of affluence. I like watching that sort of stuff, and so do I. I do. But what we're missing is that stories have evolved with a really important behavioral function. And it's naive for us to think that there's no responsibility in telling them, that there isn't this inherent responsibility when it comes to storytelling. It's really naive for us to think that we can just tell any story we like without it having consequences, when you think about the role that stories have played over human evolution. So this application to stories within the information landscape that I'm just talking about is really just one example of how we can apply this behavioral crisis framing to drive real systemic change. And this framing helps us to shape the information landscape, shape consequences, and to make useful sense of what is occurring around us in this world. And we've been really fortunate that the framing has been taken, or has begun to take hold with some incredibly influential people. But I think that's the beauty. That's the beauty of finding things that are reinforcing and adaptive as they work. So I'm going to leave you with a few suggestions on how you can apply this framing more in your world. Because I really believe, and I'm biased, but I really believe that our work as a species is to collectively shape our information landscape for these truly adaptive, pro-social behaviors, with all of this and much more in mind. So the first thing that you can do is to constantly try and anchor yourself at the behavioral level. So that means challenging our species' false assumptions on how to affect change. You can begin to do this as simply as asking yourself questions like, what do I want to achieve in my work behaviorally? How will this thing that I'm working on influence behavior or influence social norms, or how will it shape the culture? And when working on projects as well, try and stay anchored at the behavioral level the whole way through. And you might be surprised at how difficult it is not to kind of wander back or default back to these collective false assumptions that we hold about how the world works. And you can also begin critiquing the information landscape. So how is this thing in front of me influencing behavior or culture or both? If you go into a supermarket, for example, you can pick up a product and you can look at it and ask it, how did you get here? How were you selected for? Because it has been selected for. What are the consequences? How is it reinforcing? Where are the punishing consequences? Are they being discounted temporally, spatially, socially? Is this thing adaptive or maladaptive or both in different time horizons, and in what ways, and at different scales? So before long, you will start to see the world as an information landscape with these hidden behavioral drivers and influences. And as I mentioned before as well, these things often show up as stories. So this is one of my personal favorites. Of a kind of I would still classify this as a pretty explicit story, but it is a bit implicit too. And this one's from Apple in regard to, I'm not sure if you've seen this campaign by them, the Mother Nature Needs a Status Report campaign, but it's an utterly maladaptive story dressed up as an adaptive one. And you'll begin to see not only the role that systems and institutions and industries play, but also the role that each one of us plays. And again, for the 5,000th time, remember that if you want to drive change that will persist, focus on reinforcing and truly adaptive consequences. That's really the only way they will stand up to evolutionary forces. Lastly, and I'm saying this mainly because you're all studying, but get as interdisciplinary as you can. This one isn't that easy because A, academia isn't really a fan of it, and B, the human brain wasn't designed for this level of complexity. It's pretty understandable that humans have broken the world up into these silos, and labeled everything to fit things into our little primate cognitive capacities. But the world doesn't work in silos. It doesn't really work in silos. And so in the Institute, for example, we run consilient sessions, which are essentially working to pull various scientific disciplines together and achieve some level of consilience on relevant topics. Excuse me. So please work to bring other disciplines that bring other aspects of reality into your work. And Mike is a living, breathing example of someone who does this well. Thank you all for your time.